Well, welcome to Blue Collar Reformation. Today we're going to be doing some historical study on a subject called the Siege of Munster. There's a rebellion in the city of Munster, and we basically are going to just go through some of the history of this. The reason for it is because these pieces of history, these moments in history are so helpful to understand kind of where the world is today and how the seeds of like revolutionary spirit and the seeds of modernism and the modern revolutionary methods originally come from old world ideas. And so I'm going to turn it over to John, my assistant here, who's prepared a study on the subject and a guide through it. And then we're just going to discuss it as we go.
All right, sounds good, PBR. So today we are talking about the madness of the Anabaptists at Munster. So firstly, to set the stage, it's the early 1500s, the early Reformation. Martin Luther had just nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg door. John Calvin is busy running his theocratic project in Geneva, although this is a good theocratic project. We're going to be covering a bad theocratic project today. And the Holy Roman Empire is juggling about 14 different wars of religion and peasant uprisings at once, so it's a chaotic time. In the midst of this upheaval, you get the Anabaptists, the radical reformers who took sola scriptura to mean sola scriptura, with their core belief being that infant baptism, as it was being rendered by Rome and also carried on by the magisterial reformers, was invalid, and that they needed to be rebaptized again after developing conscious faith.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about this time period is that the Anabaptists have kind of been around before the Reformation and are flowing into this time and are associated in the minds of the Roman Catholics as just anybody who isn't Roman is basically of this same ilk. And so there's a guilt by association that comes from the Anabaptists to the Baptists today. The Baptists today really have their roots in like the independent Reformation in England, like the British Reformation. But it's also important to notice that they really believe that there's this age of the Spirit, that there's a time that's come now that is an age of a Spirit that's different from before. So you had the age of the Father in the Old Testament, then you had the age of Christ, and now they believe they've entered into this age of the Spirit, very similar to like a process theology or a Hegelian theology that you see in the modern period of a progress of religion, and now in the age of the Spirit having come forward, they are to be rebaptized because they're not really part of the old thing anymore.
Right. But they also had some, criticisms which were a little bit more on target, as in like, not liking the two swords doctrine of Rome. Please read our Substack article on culture and state if you want a little more information on that. And also the magisterial Reformation also had potential for abuse as far as, the confusion of state and church power. But the problem is how they went about trying to remedy these perceived issues. So that brings us to Munster, a city in Westphalia, just a quaint little town that became ground zero for the Proto-Branch Davidians. And please do hold that thought. That's not a flippant comparison. So how did it start? Well, in 1534, Munster, being a mostly Catholic city, had been just going along normally, but then bam, a bunch of radical Anabaptists start moving in. And they're led by a fiery preacher named Bernard Rothman. Rothman had a thing for denouncing infant baptism, rejecting private property, and also generally making himself unpopular with local authorities. Things then escalated when a pair of Dutch Anabaptists named John Matthias and John van Leyden showed up. So usually the Dutch are the good guys when we're talking about the Reformation, but very much not the case this time. Matthias and Leyden were previously followers of a guy named Melchior Hoffman. So Melchior Hoffman was a German Anabaptist who tried to start his own doomsday cult in Strasbourg, and later ended up being imprisoned based off of what his two
it seems like that always ends badly.
Yeah. Doomsday cults, generally not a very high ROI.
No.
Yeah. So this triumvirate then assembled between Rothman, Matthias, and Leyden, and they convinced Munster that they were going to become the new Jerusalem, the place where God would bring in his kingdom, smite the unbelievers, and establish a glorious theocracy, basically reign in the millennium. It was this millenarian eschatology which had existed beforehand, but was now being basically turned up to 11 and weaponized in this case.
Well, they believed that they were the ordained ones of the Spirit to bring this in, and they believed that it was like a divine mandate, and that not only was Christ's kingdom coming in a physical way, but they were really the beginning of the incarnation of that. They were like the new thing. So it's strange to say, because like this has happened over and over again throughout history. As early as the 2nd century, Montanus was saying the same thing.
Right.
In the Middle Ages, you had the Cathari, sometimes called the Cathars. They did the same thing, and they all have the same underpinnings of a Neoplatonic view of the world, where there's these ages moving forward, and what you end up with is that it just so happens that the guy who reattaches himself to this old ideology ends up being the guy. Every time. Turns out I am the incarnation of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, like they were just the 16th century version of the guy on the street corner with the "end is near" sign.
Yeah.
But the significant difference being they had a lot of followers and they were also armed.
Yeah.
So, under their leadership, Munster officially became an Anabaptist stronghold. The city council was overthrown, the Catholics and Lutherans were exiled, and the new government was established. A theocracy where everyone got rebaptized, whether they liked it or not. And if you think that's bad, just wait. It gets worse. Now let's talk about the theology driving this madness. The Anabaptists believed Munster was the New Jerusalem, not metaphorically, not spiritually, but literally, as in they thought Munster was going to be the city where Christ will return to establish his millennial reign. They were so convinced of this that they actually started calling it Zion. And if history has taught us anything, it's that when people start renaming places after biblical prophecy, bad things tend to happen. So, what did the Anabaptists do with their newfound power? Well, they got right to work. First, by rebaptizing everyone who hadn't fled, because of course nothing says holy city like 4 sacraments at sword point.
That's always the end game of cults. Like, you have to keep the cult going by some sort of there's some sort of force. There's a force of weapons in this case, or the force of weapons in Islam, or you have some dirt on people. Like, that's a classic tendency of like cult leaders these days, because like the federal government doesn't allow them to do those kinds of things. So what they'll do is they'll get dirt on each person, and then they'll keep that and they'll use it to blackmail them. Right. These are like the kind of tactics that you see.
Yeah. In February 1534, the leaders went and abolished private property. That's right. Munster became one of the first attempts at a communalist Christian society. Everyone had to turn over their money, food, and goods to a common treasury, which in theory is supposed to sound like early Acts 2, but in reality it functioned more like, if you don't hand over your stuff, we'll take it from you. And oddly enough, the residents began to notice that this triumvirate became extremely wealthy overnight, which, weird how that works.
Some things never change.
Yeah, it's like, everything's going to be common, we're all going to be equal, but, we're just going to be a little more equal than you.
Yeah, yep.
So then we get to the next brilliant move. Expelling all unbelievers. In this case, an unbeliever meant anyone who wasn't on board with the whole Munster as Zion program. It didn't matter if you were a Catholic, a Lutheran, or even an Anabaptist who just thought that this was a bad idea. If you didn't convert, you were shown the door. This should have been a red flag. If your theological movements leads you to seize power, confiscate property, and exile dissenters before you even get to the apocalyptic visions and proclamations of heavenly kingship, which are coming, you might be on the wrong path. So this cult triumvirate all of a sudden begins to prophesy that Christ will return on Easter of 1534 and deliver them. But here's where things take a truly unhinged turn. Because while Munster is playing theocratic commune, the world outside is very much not thrilled. They expel Catholics, and Lutherans don't go quietly into the night. They run straight to Franz von Waldeck, the Prince Bishop of Munster. Now, if you're unfamiliar with 16th century ecclesiastical politics, please let me summarize. A prince bishop is what happens when the medieval church decides that being a spiritual shepherd is fine and all, but being a warlord would be even better. Which, while that does sound metal, it sounds extremely metal. It's one of the few things that the Anabaptists were right to be wary of.
Yeah, that's a confusion of powers for sure. But, the result is that they end up having, an end to the Munster Rebellion through this.
Yeah.
So,
I guess it all works out in the end. But in any case, back to the rebellion in progress. Waldeck, being a man of both Reformation piety and heavy artillery, gathers an army and lays siege to Munster in April 1534. The city is completely surrounded, food supplies start dwindling, and now Munster's Anabaptist leaders have to make a choice. Do they negotiate? Do they seek peace? Well, the answer would be no. No, they do not. Jan Matthias, in all his prophetic brilliance, decides that he alone will end the siege. How? Well, because God told him personally that he was going to spite the enemy, Gideon style, or at least that's what he claimed. And so, on Easter Sunday, April 4th, 1534, Matthias rode out of the Munster gates with just 12 men, fully believing that divine intervention was about to turn the tide according to the prophecy, because it was Easter after all. Spoiler alert, it did not.
It's dumb ways to die.
Yeah, 12 guys against a whole army. Yeah, I mean, I'm like, unless you are like in the mold of like redemptive history in like the Old Testament, this usually doesn't go well.
Yeah.
So, how did this glorious God-ordained battle go? Well, imagine a professional army with cannons and pikemen staring in disbelief as a single man and a dozen followers charge at them with swords. It was over in minutes. The bishop's forces didn't just kill Matthias, they absolutely obliterated him. And then, because apparently they wanted to make a point, they chopped up his body and stuck his head on a pike outside the city. Oh yeah, also Rothman apparently died here. It's not written exactly how this happens. We just know he was never seen again after this. Now, you would think that this would have been a sobering moment for the Anabaptists inside Munster. Maybe it was time for reflection. Maybe this whole New Jerusalem thing wasn't going as planned. Maybe, just maybe, this is where the part where they reconsider their life choices. No. Instead, Munster doubled down. And this is where things go from ill-advised to completely unhinged. With Matthias and Rothman dead, the leadership passed to Jan van Leyden, who saw Matthias' death not as a theological crisis, but as an opportunity. And what do ambitious cult leaders do in times of crisis? Declare themselves king, of course, because even though Christ is technically the king of Israel, according to their own theology, he clearly needs some scheming Dutch guy to keep the throne warm until he comes back, which he was already supposed to have done by Easter, but yeah, we're not going to let that get in the way of a good story. At this point, things are fully off the rails. First, he sets up a royal court with all the pomp and extravagance of a Renaissance prince. Fancy clothes, golden robes, and a literal throne in the city square. Then, he starts spreading the fear of the Moon Turk. Yes, he believed that there was an Ottoman Turk living in the moon, watching them at night. I mean, it's really not consequential to the story. It just really goes to show.
It shows how far they had gone.
Yeah, like, there's a Turkish guy in the moon and he's watching you.
I don't know why you're worried about these soldiers outside. The moon is watching us.
So, naturally, a theocratic kingdom needs laws. One of van Leyden's first acts, mandatory polygamy. So he personally took as many as 16 wives. So for obvious reasons, this wasn't popular even among his followers. And he also mandated that it was illegal for any woman above the age of 14 to be unmarried. Ew. To get around this, many women and girls were married to already married men as a form of legal protection. Basically, these men would marry these women so they wouldn't then be snatched up as part of Leyden's harem. But after noticing a noticeable lack in new pregnancies, Leyden does away with this loophole and essentially declares all women in the city to be his property. Those men who were actually married all of a sudden weren't too thrilled that their wives were now officially property of the King of Zion, but Leyden crushed dissent pretty efficiently. Public executions became common. If you so much as questioned him, you were exiled, thrown in prison, or just beheaded.
So I'm an Anabaptist in the city of Munster, and like he's confiscated all the women, so including my wife and daughters, and I'm supposed to, I'm asking myself, do you approve of what's going on? Like, how do you get to that point where you have followed this guy to the ends of the earth and you're like, yes, this is good. Am I happy with this? Yes, I'm happy with this. We're going to keep going. We're not going to open the doors to the siege. It's just insane. But, it's an amazing thing that people get wrapped up into this way of thinking, but it does happen over and over again in history.
And wait, it gets worse. Because this is where we meet Bernard Knipperdoling. Knipperdoling was one of van Leyden's most fanatical supporters. Before the rebellion, he'd been a wealthy cloth merchant, but now he was basically Munster's chief executioner. His job, making sure the King of Zion's enemies, both real and imagined, met an untimely and very public end, including one Elizabeth von Scherer, who was beheaded by Knipperdolling on the spot in the market for refusing to marry Leiden, which, I mean, the terribleness of that aside, is a kind of loyalty that's really hard to find anywhere these days.
It's true.
Yeah.
Good loyal soldiers. Yeah, it's quite a
yeah,
thing.
you know, he's like, whoa, like I'm Leiden's top guy. I need to behead this woman, you know?
Yeah. The disrespect that she didn't want to marry the king of the city.
Yeah. Well, anyway, meanwhile, back in the real world, Franz von Waldeck's siege wasn't going anywhere fast. The Anabaptists, despite their descent into madness, were stubborn. They had weapons. They had food stores. Well, for a while anyway. And they had Knipperdolling enthusiastically enforcing discipline. So rather than storm the city, Waldeck decided to starve them out. Inside Munster, though, things got desperate. Food shortages started setting in. People were rationing whatever they could find. And as conditions worsened, Van Leyden doubled down on the divine mission narrative. If they just held out a little longer, God would deliver them any day now. Oh, and of course, to help with bolstering their defense, they hired mercenaries. Now, most mercenaries in the Holy Roman Empire, whether they be Lutheran or Catholic, wanted nothing to do with this because it was so obviously, like, out of hand. But they did find one willing party, the Irish. Because of course they did. You know, I suppose they do anything for a bowl of Lucky Charms.
Hey, good hard work is good work.
Yeah. Yeah, just don't bring your wife with you. But Leyden just wasn't playing defense. He was still ruling with absolute power. He made sure that he, Knipperdolling, and the rest of the inner circle were very well fed, even as the common people were starving, and to no surprise, pointing this out was very illegal. Very like North Korea style. It's like, hey, why is the supreme leader really fat when, like, I'm dying of famine? Many in the city at this point were resorting to eating grass, the straw from their roofs, and this point is very hotly debated, but I'm still going to throw it in there anyway. The bodies of the deceased.
Yeah, that's so common in siege warfare throughout history.
So it probably happens.
It's an obvious thing. What ends up happening, you're out of food. People eat everything they can get their hands on.
And that means everything.
Meat is meat, human cuts,
Yeah. So at this point, if you're wondering, can this possibly get worse? My dear listener, just wait. At this point, it's worth asking, why were these people still following this guy? Surely some Munsterites had to be thinking, maybe we made a wrong turn somewhere in between believers-only baptism and holy dictatorship with mandatory harems, including my wife. Well, it's not like they really had much of a choice.
Am I happy about this? No, I am not.
Yeah. Considering that, Leiden's gang, and it was essentially rolling like the Taliban now.
Yeah.
I mean, on this point, it's worth talking about Knipperdolling again, because this guy really did, with a full, loyalty and fire in his heart, embraced his role as chief enforcer. Because it's also worth mentioning that he had actually been a Lutheran before the rebellion, and he only converted to Anabaptism after getting swept up in the frenzy when he was in the city. Which just goes to show you can start off with half-decent theology and then still end up being the chief executioner of the King of Zion anyway, if you're not careful. In any case, the growing desperation and quickly wavering faith of the Munsterites. Despite this, the grizzled hands of Knipperdolling upon the executioner's blade made sure that nobody was going anywhere or doing anything without Leyden's say-so. Well, or so he thought, because on the night of the 24th of June, 1535, more than a year after the start of this madness, that's when a couple of Munsterites finally snapped and decided, you know what, maybe letting a delusional polygamist who called himself the King of Israel run the city wasn't such a great idea. So in the middle of the night, a group of desperate citizens, near-starved and tired of watching Knipperdolling execute their neighbors, opened the gates to Franz von Waldeck's army. And let me tell you, once the Prince Bishop's forces got inside, they did not come peacefully. The soldiers stormed Munster, and what followed was absolute carnage. The city turned into a bloodbath, a full-on sack. Because, remember, this wasn't just an army reclaiming territory. These were soldiers who had spent more than a year stuck in miserable siege camps, watching their comrades die from disease and starvation, and hearing constant horror stories from those who managed to escape the city. They were not feeling particularly merciful on that day.
Well, let's be honest about these guys who opened the door too. They had been in there for a year and a half. It is almost unfathomable that they would allow it to go on that long. They're finally, they they finally get up the gumption. You know what? I guess maybe this project has run afoul somewhere.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's like like the Johnny Cash hurt. It's like, where did I go wrong?
Right, yeah, yeah.
I mean, a while ago, but it's
Yeah.
better late than never.
It was somewhere around the first doomsday prophecy, somewhere around there.
I mean, really, like this guy wants my wife should have been like the
yeah. Oh yeah, that's like that bridge being crossed should have been pretty obvious to everybody, because how does that square with the scriptures? Well, so the part of the understanding is the Anabaptist theology has to do with the spirit, the age of the spirit. And so the acts of the body are not necessarily sinful any longer in this context, right? So not all Anabaptists, but in the Anabaptist theology, what they believe about the age of the spirit moving forward is that there's no distinction now. There's no laws like the old laws now. They still have their laws. They have their rules, obviously, very legalistic. But the things that went away are things like private property. There's no longer any distinction between that. Having privacy of your own body, things like that go away, because those are part of the old order. The new order has come, this age of the spirit. The spirit, the internal spark, the spirit of man is why they had to be rebaptized, because there's like a change of the internal person. And so that change having happened, now having this spiritual enlightenment, now you've got to be rebaptized into this new order. And so the reason for the rejection of the old ways of like having one man, one wife, and moving to a full communist ideology is because of this rejection of the flesh, rejection of the body.
Right. The rejection of the natural order.
Yeah. Well, rejection of physicality, ultimately, that they believed that they were going to enter into a full age of the spirit. And I mean, hail Bob Comet much, I mean.
Yeah. I mean, this is like really where this all starts.
Yeah.
So now with the siege over, Waldeck victorious over this rabble, we come to the fate of the rebels. John Leyden, our self-proclaimed King of Zion, he who claimed to be divinely appointed and the ruler of the New Jerusalem, untouchable by mere mortals, was captured. Along with him, Bernard Knipperdoling and another top lieutenant, Bernard Krechting, were also taken alive. So Franz von Waldeck, being a Lutheran, a supporter of Martin Luther and the Magisterial Reformation, wanted to make an example of these Anabaptists. So here's what happened. Van Leyden, Knipperdoling, and Krechting were thrown into iron cages and paraded around the town. They were then locked away for months while Waldeck decided on the perfectly reasonable and humane punishment for these folks. On January 22nd, 1536, the three of them were brought out into Munster's main square from what can only be described as a Renaissance horror show. They were each chained to a giant iron post, and then over the course of several agonizing hours, red-hot tongs were used to tear the flesh apart, but piece by piece.
It would have been quite the sight.
So, cruel, yes. Unusual, also yes. But undeserved, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Their bodies were then stuffed into iron cages and hoisted up on the steeple of St. Lambert's Church as a warning to any future would-be theocratic revolutionaries. All right. And here's the kicker. Those cages are still there today.
So those cages, you were telling me earlier that they don't have the skeletons in them anymore?
They put them back in there for like I think like the anniversaries, but they're not permanently in there.
Because they used to just have like fake skeletons up there just to remind people of the history of what happened. It's a pretty famous, event. It's really important for that city. And man, that would be quite a thing to see as a tourist. Oh, what's with the cages with the skeletons? It's like, well, let me tell you a story. Believe me, this one's worth waiting for.
Yeah, I mean, that is the story of the Munster Rebellion, the absolute madness and depravity that went on there. And really, I mean, it can teach us a lot about, perhaps not as outwardly evil and psychotic. In some cases, I mean, it might be still.
I don't know. I think that we see that today too. Right. Because if you think about, the extension of Anabaptism, the Anabaptism, became much more ameliorated over time. The Amish are so humble and gentle and everything. The Mennonites, they're Anabaptistic, but they embraced the Reformation on many key points. They became a much more mainstream evangelicals. But the spirit of Anabaptism in German Pietism and the connections with the same forms of theology, where you have this internal spirit of man, eventually becomes a modernistic, indomitable human spirit. This age of progress of the Anabaptists, this progressive thinking, eventually in German Pietism becomes the seedbed for Hegelian thought, where you have progress that's coming forward and there's this inevitable spiritual movement forward. That's progressivism. That's the political left, and a lot of the ideology comes originally from the Middle Ages, and then the Renaissance era like this, and then through German Pietism becomes modernistic thinking, where it's at the same time rationalistic and even empiricist at times. It's ultimately believing that there's this progress forward. And so, 15, 20 years ago, I was talking about how there's a possibility of these things coming about politically again. And now, in the 2020 era and since, right, we've seen that there is this radicalism that's come up in our own country. And a lot of it is supported by leftist religion and theological liberalism and political liberalism. Right. So it's important to remember these things in history, because they explain why are the things that people do so repetitive throughout history. It's because basically you have the same ideological underpinnings, and it ends up resulting in the same kind of actions.
Right. Which is also, where we get the solution is from history as well. So we got to flay them and put them in a cage. Kidding, of course. I'm kidding.
Yeah. This is for YouTube. So we're kidding.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us on this very special episode with such a wonderful story. I really enjoyed listening to it, and hope you do too. So this is PBR and John signing off.
Good night, and don't let the moon Turk bite.
Thank you for watching Blue Collar Reformation. We are here to equip you with wisdom of the Word. The aim is to apply the system of doctrine taught in Scripture to every square inch of faith and life. We are on Twitter and Substack for your sake. Links are in the description. Share with your recalcitrant and reprobate friends and family freely. Blue Collar Reformation is a lightweight and mobile outreach platform. Take it in hand and enter the fray. Godspeed.